On December 26, 1991, the glory of one empire was rising slowly over the corpse of another. Throughout thousands of years of human history, no country has ever had such deep and wide control over everything on this blue planet. The Sahara Desert's massive machines are constantly pulling black gold from the earth, formed over billions of years, while delicate Arabica coffee trees in Latin America thrive in slave-run plantations. In the far-off east, hard-working and down-to-earth laborers are grinding away day and night to produce cheap industrial goods. The profits they generate keep getting funneled into giant cities like New York and Los Angeles, turning into towering statues that symbolize great freedom. This is the golden age that all American politicians long for. That year, Biden was 49 and had already been a senator for 20 years. He could never have imagined that 30 years later, when he finally achieved his dream of sitting in the presidential seat, he would have to endure the agony of his declining health, sitting in a chair just to uphold the last remnants of the American empire. As the final legacy of the Cold War political elite, Biden, in his twilight years, marks the end of an era. His life, filled with speculation, struggle, and intrigue, serves as the perfect epitome of this time. In 1965, a grad student at Syracuse University Law School was getting chewed out by his professor because 5 pages of his final paper were directly copied from an article in the Fordham Law Review. The young guy argued that it was unintentional and that he just didn't know the proper citation rules. In the end, he got an F but was allowed to retake the course. That student is now the President of the United States, Joe Biden. This wasn't the first time he plagiarized. Back in 1987, while running for the Democratic presidential nomination, Biden lifted parts of a speech from Neil Kinnock, the leader of the UK Labour Party. He even copied details about Kinnock's background and life experiences word for word. But it's not like Biden was just being lazy about it. He actually worked hard to overcome his stutter as a kid by practicing speeches and tongue twisters in front of a mirror every day until high school. He knows exactly which parts he can cut corners on to reach his goals and which parts he absolutely can't. In high school, Biden mostly got B's, but when it came time to run for leadership, he was super involved, even serving as class president for both junior and senior classes. In college, even though he cared way more about sports and socializing than studying, he still managed to double major in history and political science. His overall grades weren't great, he ranked 506th out of 688 students, but to Biden, what mattered most was just getting that degree. The ranking didn't really matter. After graduating from college, Biden went to Syracuse University Law School. He said it was the most boring place in the world, but he still managed to earn his law degree, finishing 76th in a class of 85. Right after law school, he joined a company with ties to the Democratic Party. A year later, he successfully ran for a seat on the Newcastle County Council. It wasn't too hard to get elected in a district with only 20,000 people or so, but just 2 years later, with no political background, Biden decided to run for U.S. Senate in Delaware. This was a total long shot. Back then, the senator from Delaware was the seasoned Republican, John Burris, who had been the governor for 15 years, so he had a solid grip on the state. Because of that, the local Democrats were pretty much too scared to take him on. But that's exactly what gave the newcomer, Biden, a chance to step up. Still, the Democrats barely gave him any campaign funding for this obvious uphill battle, and pre-election polls showed Biden trailing by over 30 percentage points at one point. But Biden didn't give up, his stubborn side kicked in again. He rallied all his college friends to help him hand out flyers and chant slogans. He personally showed up to over 10 voter meet and greets every day, even going door to door to talk with anyone who might change their mind. With his keen instincts, he even fabricated some stories about his anti-Vietnam War activism to gain sympathy and support from a lot of young people. Since Delaware is small and has a low population, with only 3 counties, this kind of appealing strategy really worked wonders for the campaign. In November 1972, the Senate election in Delaware wrapped up with Biden narrowly defeating his strong opponent, Burgess, by just over 3,000 votes. This made Biden the youngest senator in Delaware's history, officially kicking off his political career in a nearly legendary way at just 29 years old. Every member of the House wants to be a senator, and every senator wants to be president. By 2007, Biden had already been in the Senate for 35 years, becoming a big political player like Burgess. It's said that no matter where in the world you drop Biden, he'll have friends there. When the US and China first established diplomatic relations in 1979, Biden was part of the American delegation that visited Beijing. After the Soviet Union collapsed, he was a key member of the US Soviet Arms Control Delegation. Even small countries like Kazakhstan, Paris, and Georgia have old friends he's known for over 20 years. You could say wherever American interests reach, his presence is felt. Having experienced the toughest and most glorious moments of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, Biden believes he's more than qualified to sit in the president's chair. But maybe because the grand victory of the Cold War was just too dazzling, and the sudden emergence of a unipolar world came out of nowhere, the realism that American politicians developed during the Cold War seems a bit outdated in the post-Cold War era. For decades, Cold War politicians learned that every policy has consequences and costs. But after losing the Soviet Union, a rival of equal strength, the US found it could push its strategic agenda in any corner of the world with little to no cost, or even at a loss. In 1991, while Cold War politicians were still haunted by the Vietnam War, the US easily took down Iraq, the fourth strongest military, with just 148 American casualties. Former Soviet republics eagerly joined NATO, and the US was almost pushed into filling the strategic gap left by the Soviet Union. The main inheritor of the former rival, Russia, is now going all out to show the US its loyalty. This smooth sailing has created a cozy international environment for American politicians who've been growing over the past 30 years. No matter how badly they mess up, the US still comes out on top. The only thing these politicians really need to think about, and the only thing they actually care about, is their image in elections. So, good-looking politicians with great speaking skills started to become the darlings of the political scene. Clinton, Obama, and Hillary were shining stars of the Democratic Party, while the seasoned politician Biden seemed a bit faded in comparison. In 2007, at 65, Biden decided to run for president again, and when he saw his opponent was the young, handsome Obama, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of jealousy. Here was a guy who ticked all the boxes for mainstream political correctness, a smart, good-looking black man with top-notch charisma. He seemed like a character straight out of a novel. That year, Biden dropped out of the presidential race early on and threw his support behind Obama. No surprise, Obama ended up in the Oval Office. But Biden didn't come away empty-handed. He snagged the VP spot. Even though he was a bit bitter about it, Biden still put his extensive experience and connections to good use, helping to build the Obama legacy. In 2008, when the crisis in Georgia erupted, Biden was called to action to represent the U.S. in negotiations between Georgia and the Russian military. Then in 2010, to help Obama get his plans on track, Biden was busy networking with Congress members to clear the way for approval. Fast forward to 2014, during the Crimea crisis, Biden became the top envoy for the Obama administration dealing with Ukraine and other Eastern European countries. By the time he turned 75, he had spent 8 years working in the White House. Obama awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, representing the highest honor in the country, and publicly stated that Biden would be the next president. However, when Biden actually considered running for president in 2016, Obama personally stepped in to persuade him not to, believing that Hillary had a better chance of beating the Republican nominee, Trump. Just when Biden thought he'd never get a shot at the presidency, history took another turn. That year, the Democratic star Hillary, waving the banner of political correctness, narrowly lost to the internet-savvy Trump. For decades, America has acted on the will of capital, treating other countries like a garden to plunder and the people like mere resources to exploit. But it turns out, political actions always come with consequences. Resentment and intense joy just build up slowly in unseen places until that repressed energy turns into a tidal wave of public opinion that catapults the rebellious Trump into the presidency. By then, nobody can pretend they didn't see it coming. In 2020, with Trump riding high, the Democratic Party's star politicians all went quiet, not wanting to risk their political futures. This time, 77-year-old Biden has no challengers as he takes on this battered nation, a fading politician in a declining empire. While everyone laughs at his old age and decay, Biden is set to remind the world of the fear that came with Cold War dominance through his ruthless strategies. The hollowing out of industries and the outsourcing of manufacturing started back during the Obama era. Politicians knew what the root of America's social issues was: but it wasn't until the Trump era that they realized the problem had become urgent enough to threaten the political balance at home. Biden, who's been around the political scene for 50 years, has a unique perspective on how to tackle this crisis and bring manufacturing back to the U.S. Instead of luring companies back with all sorts of incentives, it'd be better to make them beg to come back to the U.S. In September 2021, the U.S. Commerce Department demanded that global semiconductor manufacturers like Samsung, TSMC, and Intel submit core confidential information, such as chip inventory, order numbers, and sales data. Using national power to force global companies to spill their trade secrets is a blatant act of bullying that will seriously damage America's credibility. The lengths the U.S. is willing to go to suggest that a major and unusual move is on the horizon. On February 4, 2022, the U.S. Congress passed the 2022 America Competes Act, allocating $97 billion to boost the domestic semiconductor industry. Just 4 days later, the European Union rolled out its own chip legislation aimed at countering the U.S., planning to invest over €43 billion to support chip production, research projects, and startups. But just under 20 years later, with a bang in Eastern Europe, Europe's security situation took a nosedive. The EU's chip legislation turned into a complete joke. The US didn't even have to compete with the EU in the market, the outcome was already decided. Plus, the semiconductor industry is just a tiny piece of Biden's massive strategy. This time, the US isn't just interested in Europe's enthusiasm or even just the semiconductor industry, it's looking to completely choke off the EU's economic growth potential. They want to redirect high-end industries like automotive, chemicals, and machinery that the EU has built up over decades back to the US to rebuild its industrial chain. To achieve this, they need to create a long-term, irreversible decline in Europe's business environment. For this, the US has set up 4 major crises for Europe: an energy crisis, a refugee crisis, a food crisis, and a financial crisis. First off, the US is pushing hard for a decoupling between Russia and Europe, which has caused energy prices across Europe to skyrocket. Factory costs are closely tied to energy prices, and with those prices going up, the cost of living for residents is also rising, leading to higher labor costs. Based on past oil crises, Europe's GDP could shrink by 2% to 5%, and manufacturing might drop by over 15%. Plus, this energy crisis is hitting all traditional energy sources: oil, natural gas, coal, so the impact on the European economy is going to be even more severe. Then there's the refugee crisis. According to the statistics released by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees on March 5, over 1.368 million Ukrainian refugees have fled to European countries. If the crisis continues, it's expected that there will be 4 million refugees. This huge number will put a long-term strain on the EU's finances and social order. Plus, with Ukraine, known as the breadbasket of Europe, if they can't plant their crops on time this year, Europe will face a food crisis. At the same time, Russia owes the EU hundreds of billions of euros in foreign debt, and they've decided to pay off the debts to unfriendly countries in rubles. A lot of defaults are going to trigger a financial crisis in the EU. In recent years, the EU is facing a perfect storm of crises: an energy crisis, a refugee crisis, a food crisis, a financial crisis, and an industrial crisis all hitting at once. It's easy to see that Germany, and the entire EU, could see its manufacturing sector take a nosedive. The best-case scenario is that after a sharp economic downturn, both investment and consumption shrink, leading to a long stretch of zero growth. The worst-case scenario? The massive industries built up over decades in Germany and France could be completely wiped out by the US, resulting in the EU falling apart and Europe turning into something like Latin America. These days, the US keeps insisting that it won't get directly involved while continuously pouring support into Ukraine, not allowing them to surrender. It's pretty clear that their goal is to drag out the conflict for as long as possible. Given the intensity and scope of this crisis, it feels like a ruthless strategy that's just going to hurt in the long run. On March 2, Biden, feeling pretty proud during his State of the Union address, said that we won't solve America's problems by cutting wages. He's got a better idea to regain our cost advantage without lowering pay. This means the US will be making more cars and semiconductors, building up infrastructure, and rolling out innovative products that are faster and cheaper. Plus, it'll create more job opportunities without relying on foreign suppliers, all made right here in America. At 80 years old, Biden is making a bold statement to the world, showing that even though he's getting up there in age, you should never underestimate this guy who's been a dominant force for over a century. But as mentioned earlier, every political move has its consequences. On February 27, German Chancellor Scholz made a big announcement in the Berlin Bundestag, declaring that Germany will rearm itself to defend Europe, to thunderous applause from the crowd. Just a week ago, if any politician had the guts to openly talk about Germany rearming, it would have meant the end of their political career, and they might even have been accused of treason. Meanwhile, a chain reaction has already kicked off in the Middle East with Iran and Saudi Arabia, and in South Asia with India and Pakistan. The world is in chaos, and people's sentiments are shifting. I wonder if that old man who started all this really has the confidence and ability to wrap it up decently.